Welcome to Diversitas, a podcast at the crossroads of diversity, business, and culture. Today we have Kenyatta James, Program Director for Philadelphia Anchors for Growth and Equity, PAGE, a program housed within the Economy League of Greater Philadelphia. We will speak to Mr. James about his work with PAGE and about new developments in supplier diversity, including the potential impact on DEI of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. Welcome, Kenyatta. How are you?
I'm doing well, I guess as well as we can be given the weight of the recent decision.
Yes. So you know what? Let's start with that because it really is now a cloud that hangs over us in the DEI business. So you tell me, first of all, what was your take on the Supreme Court decision, and what do you think the impact will be on what we do potentially?
The decision was interesting. I spent an inordinate amount of time on TikTok yesterday, listening to people reading page by page through the decision, different legal scholars, PhDs, and other professionals. And I thought especially Justice Clarence Thomas's response was interesting. He had a really long history lesson in there.
Right.
Basically explained all the reasons why we need this programs, but his conclusion was, and that's why things should be colorblind, which is not surprising. It feels like a pretty common tactic by opponents of these sorts of race remediation programs.
Right.
But it was still a little bit annoying to hear, especially coming from someone like Justice Thomas. I think that we are going to see a tremendous amount of legal pressure on everything from diversity inclusion programs and construction. I can see that being a really easy initial target. Government mandates around diversity and participation on the federal infrastructure bill money that's like cycling through the ecosystem right now, but also attacks on private institutions, right? And I think that that's going to probably shape up a little bit differently state to state, region to region.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's going to create a lot of downward pressure on these programs. And it's going to allow people that were bad or not really genuine actors to back away from this programming, to say, oh, well, you know, there's going to be legal ramifications, you know, the risk is too high. We don't want to be in this space. And then to just put things down that they maybe didn't really want to do anyway. It's unfortunate, but I think that this is probably the worst solution to come after like all of the protest and push that happened with George Floyd. To now flip into a negative legal framework is, I think, one of the most dangerous ways to dissipate that energy.
Tell us about your work. I mean, I know that, you know, when we think about where our country is headed right now, it certainly is not encouraging. But the reality is that the work continues. So tell us about the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis with PAGE.
Yeah, so I run Philadelphia Anchors for Growth and Equity. We are basically a regional supplier diversity collaborative. So we work with a series of Philadelphia eds and meds, as well as a couple of the insurance companies, some light manufacturing companies, and others in the region to help them diversify their supply chains. So basically, we reach out to them and we say, you know, what sort of opportunities do you have coming up? What are the areas where you're spending a lot of money? Are there MBEs participating in these bids? Are these things going out to bid? Who are the primes? And would those primes partner with a local minority-owned or woman-owned business? And wherever possible, we create the space for connection. We help with RFP design. We do consulting with the businesses to just make sure that things are a good fit. And we do a lot of direct introductions. So our long-term goal is to really build the region by creating more opportunities for the entrepreneurs of color that have traditionally been locked out, Philadelphia gets that statistic a lot that we are the poorest big city in the
Right.
country.
Right.
But in reality, we're just the blackest big city in the country, right?
Right.
We have the poverty rates that have come from disinvestment in Black communities. And we have that at a larger scale, a higher percentage than other
Right.
cities. Our goal is to be a piece. You know what I mean? Entrepreneurship isn't the only way forward, but to be a piece of that solution by creating more sustainable business opportunities for the segments of the community that have not benefited from the investment in the region.
Let me ask you an aside there. So as you grew up and went to college, I'm assuming that you learned about, you know, American history, maybe African American history, whatever it was. And did you come to a point where you believed that the economic approach to uplifting people of color was an important approach to address?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Um, I feel like economics is always an interesting topic when we talk about people of color and our experience in this country, right?
Mhm.
So a little bit of background about me. My mother's side of the family is Black American. My father's side of the family is West African. He's from Mali. And when you look at and when you know people from third world countries that are Black, and you see the way they struggle with like development and economics and the things that they face, and then you look at what we deal with here, um, it gives you an interesting perspective and a little bit of an outside perspective.
Tell us about that perspective.
Yeah, so I think about things like informal economies, right? One of the big problems that most African countries have is that they have this huge informal sector of the economy that's not taxable, that there's no infrastructure around, that doesn't produce savings or like transactions above a certain level that allow for economic activity. And then you see the same thing happening at a lower level, but still at an important level in Black communities, where you have a lot of people that work under the table, a lot of people that have side jobs, that have little hustles, that have these different things that don't add to their credit score, that don't add to the income that they are taxed, but it also means that it doesn't add to the income that they can take loans against.
Mm-hmm.
We don't live in a completely structured and formalized economy for ourselves much of the time. And because of that, we don't have full access to credit. We don't have full access to infrastructure, to grants. I mean, I think we saw this a lot during COVID with PPE loans, right? Our PPP loans, excuse
Right.
me,
Right.
um, where people, because they weren't a part of this formalized traditional economy, they weren't able to access the funds of other communities that,
Right.
similar entrepreneurial spirit and hustle. You have a real business. In our community, maybe you're just selling platters on Instagram, which is a great way to get started. I don't want to knock it,
Right.
but it also means that you don't have access to state resources.
Right.
And I feel like our history is a history of not having access to state resources for anything we've ever done. We've had, unfortunately, negative experiences with the state, right? Being redlined, being
Mm-hmm.
kept out of different programs, being
Mm-hmm.
denied state resources. But in the places where we should have the resources of the state, the backing of the government, whether that's local, state, federal, and the support of large institutions, we have not. Um, so for my role, where I'm able to help people gain at least one type of access to institution,
Right.
and through our capital programs, we're helping people access alternative capital and other things like that as well.
So
Um,
let's talk about um, the anchor piece of this. So Philadelphia anchors. Tell us about the anchors. How did they become anchors? What are their roles as anchors? Tell us about all of that.
Yeah, so what we call an anchor institution is kind of an institution that isn't likely to move, right? They are normally large not-for-profits in the region that are largely identified with the region, have made significant investments here. And one of the unique things about them is whether the economy is up or down, they have a certain amount of money that they make and a certain amount of money that they have to spend. And that spend is really what we're trying to capture. It's billions of dollars that they have to spend every year, no matter what, to maintain their buildings, to maintain their staffing, to
Right.
maintain
It's
their
part of their operations
operation.
and
Exactly.
capital development.
So these institutions include organizations like um, Penn Medicine and the University of Pennsylvania, Jefferson and Thomas Jefferson University, Temple and Temple Health, Independence Blue Cross, Drexel University, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And basically, these institutions came together and under the leadership of Harold Epps, when he was the commerce director here in Philadelphia, they came together and they said, okay, we all have supplier diversity programs. We all have community impact programs. And yet the issues in the city stay stubbornly entrenched, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need coordination amongst our programs, amongst our efforts, so that we can really move the needle forward. And what we found were things that were, kind of obvious in hindsight, but difficult to remedy without communication between the institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, they all worked with minority businesses that they love, but having one opportunity with a Penn or a Drexel or a Temple isn't enough to grow. It might be enough to sustain you, but it's not enough to grow. You need that institution to then vouch for you so that you can go do work with the others in a similar space. And that's how you can grow into like a regional competitor, a mid-market company. So those were the sorts of programs that we started setting up. After a while, we realized a couple things. One was that the institutions themselves needed a space where they could share best practices. And I think a really concrete example of this is payment terms. Penn figured out relatively early that they could decrease their payment terms significantly without large cost to them. Their
And
cost of
so when we talk about, for the uninitiated, when you say payment terms, what exactly are you talking about?
right,
I know you're talking to me,
right.
but we're talking to everybody else too.
Yeah, so institutions have a bad habit of paying people really, really slowly. Um, so payment terms are normally net and then an amount of time, a certain amount of days. So most institutions pay net 30, so they'll pay you in a month after you start performing work, and they've been billed for that work. Net 60 is not uncommon, and even net 90 is
Just crazy.
yeah. So you're
Net
getting
90 is
3
crazy.
months. And you can imagine for minority business owners, especially African American business owners that have traditionally not had access to banks in the same way, you don't have a lot of money sitting around, right? You
Right.
don't have a great line of credit. So you're trying to float, your business's payments for 3 months on credit cards and savings.
Right.
And it can kill a business. A
Right.
lot of businesses we see, they get a great contract and then they die because they can't float
They don't have the
cash.
capital right.
So the University of Pennsylvania looked internally and they said, hey, we could pay people a lot faster. And for minority businesses, we could pay them almost instantly.
Mm.
And it really wouldn't cost us much money. So they switched to a faster set of payment terms with net zero payment terms for MBEs across certain contract types. Made a huge difference. And one
Oh,
of the
that
things
is
we
huge.
saw and one of the things they saw is that minority businesses could actually offer lower pricing because they didn't have all the issues associated with being paid on the back end.
Right.
And then once Penn did it, Independence Blue Cross took a look internally and said, hey, could we do something similar? And as it turns out, they could. And then the Children's Hospital said, hey, I don't know if we can offer net zero, but can we do, net 15 for minority businesses? And all of these institutions started to look at their payment terms and realize very quickly that they could be a lot more effective through these
Right.
methods. So that's some of the internal learning that's able to happen.
So what? So that's good. So there's interaction around best practices. Are there commitments that the anchor institutions make within the context of PAGE as it relates to supplier diversity spend?
So they have their internal goals, and
Right.
really what we do is we try to aggregate and kind of focus those internal goals to make them as effective as possible. So they don't owe us a certain goal, but we kind of hold them responsible to the goals that they set, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I think that we've been pretty successful. So last year, our recommendations, cases we've worked on, places where we added support and did direct introductions, that came together to about $35 million in spend with our anchor institutions for local minority-owned and women-owned businesses.
Okay.
We also have a grant program. So the other thing we do is we look at where the barriers are, and we try to create opportunities for new programs, either that we create or that come from other nonprofits that have similar missions to ours.
Right.
So one of those programs is called the Hurdle Fund. It is basically a catalytic grant for minority-owned businesses to deal with an upfront cost that might be keeping them from working with an institution. Last year, we gave away about $130,000 in that grant, and it
That like for example, if the institution is requiring a certain level of insurance, right? And so
precisely.
the diversity supplier can't afford the insurance payment, and so you give them that money. Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's basically how it looks.
Right.
The thing that we see is that large institutions, they have these requirements and they never evaluate them. Like they never consider like, is this a barrier, this thing that we want, and is it necessary? And for minority-owned businesses, especially Black-owned businesses, you don't have a rich uncle who's going to just loan you like $50,000 to help you out. Like, oh, you're about to get this thing with PIN? Here's
Yeah.
something. Like, it's unlikely that we have that capital sitting around in our family. So yeah, that's exactly what it looks like.
So can I interject here? Because it is an important point, I think, that when PIN and these institutions have that kind of a policy, right? They have that policy because it protects them. They have that policy because in their world, that is a best practice to have that policy. So to get them to drop that policy, and I make the point to say this, to get them to drop the policy that is protecting them, right, as kind of actors in the market is a big lift. And so to the extent that PAGE can help to do that and has helped to do that, kudos to you, because that's not, you shouldn't take that lightly.
So one thing I will add to that is that the policies aren't always there to protect them. Sometimes the policies are there to protect incumbents. So one of
Give me an example of that.
Yeah, I think an example that makes that really clear is in the construction space. Many institutions will force everyone in the construction industry to maintain the same level of insurance, even though some people are just engineers, just architects, just doing planning, construction. So that's one of the areas where we'll see institutions be like, oh, well, you have to have the same insurance as though you were performing on the job and you had was at risk. You're like, dude, I'm literally drawing on paper in an office and sending you plans. There's no reason for us to carry the same level of like workers' comp related insurance. But for large players or for people that are packaging this together and they're doing both work and pre-construction, it's a huge competitive advantage for them to have everyone require the same insurance. So sometimes these policies are on the books. They've been kind of massaged in there either by incumbents or they were just put there a long time ago and no one has evaluated them and they
Right.
don't serve a protective value. And that's one of the things we see happens a lot. So just getting them to reevaluate certain policies and say, hey, is this necessary, is super important. But the hurdle fund does exist because we recognize some of these things are important.
Right.
So like one of the businesses we gave a grant to needed to update their cybersecurity for a tech product. They needed two-factor authentication. That's very fair. We don't expect our institutions to waive that. But what we do know is that once that minority businesses gets that additional security, it's going to make it easier for them to do work with every other institution in the region.
Right.
So it's part of a growth strategy that's good for
Right.
that business and something
Yes.
we can cover with a grant.
So we delved a little bit into your history. So tell us about how'd you get to here? How'd you get to be director of Page? What happened to you before that? How'd you get to this space?
Yeah, so I kind of started my career as a community organizer, nonprofit worker, did some really cool stuff. I moved to New York with absolutely no money to do an unpaid internship, which is a
Mm.
horrible idea. Um, but I ended up having an amazing experience learning about the human-centered design process from people at IDEO, Frog, Google, Viacom, really made some amazing connections up there and learned about this process that
How
has really
did you live though? How did you
yeah,
live?
so I stayed in I stayed with this amazing woman in an apartment in Harlem. And in the building, one of her friends was a high-level executive at a tech company that was like a social good sort of tech company. And I got a super like $10 an hour internship slash like entry-level position there, and ended up doing that in all the hours I wasn't doing this other program to cover my living costs.
That's awesome.
Which was amazing because I was sure I was going to be washing dishes. I came up there, I was like, all right, I have some restaurant experience. I know I can stand, I can wash dishes. I'll make it work. And I actually got like a decent job that I really enjoyed and
That's
learned
awesome.
about from.
Where'd you live in Harlem?
Like 115th and St. Nick.
So
So
I lived on
oh,
124th in St. Nick a long time ago.
hmm. Yeah, a lot of Philadelphians I know don't like New York because they're like, oh, it's too busy, it's too crowded. I actually enjoyed those
Yeah.
aspects. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed being in Harlem. I love the sound of like all the gospel and all the churches on Sunday mornings. I love the culture. So it was a really great experience for me. But I also couldn't afford to live in New York. So after the program was over, I moved
Right.
to Philly. I started working with the American Friends Service Committee. My family is Quaker. It's a Quaker organization.
Are you from Philadelphia?
It's a tough question. So I was born in Baltimore, and
Okay.
then I moved to Philly, and then I moved to Pittsburgh, and then I moved to Seattle, and then I moved back to Philly.
Okay.
Did this trip to New York, and then moved back to Philly.
Okay. So you're not really, I mean, you're from a lot of places.
Yeah, kind of. But
Yeah.
Philly is my favorite city in the country, and Philly is the place that like I spent the most time.
So that's interesting because I mean, we're way afield, but so what? You've lived in all these different places, and yet Philly is your favorite town. Why is that?
Philly is, I feel like, um, one of the few real, like, big, dense cities that feels diverse. Like, you can feel the presence of the people of color politically in the
That's true.
culinary scene and the culture. I love New York, I love Chicago, but I went to so many events in New York that were all white. Know what I mean? Like to be in Manhattan
Yeah.
and to go at an event at a Y and I'm the only Black person there, like that felt crazy to me.
Yeah.
And in
Yeah.
Philadelphia, I never feel like I'm far away
Right.
from members of color.
Yeah.
Same thing in Chicago, same thing in Seattle. I mean, Seattle's
Of
very,
course. Of course,
yeah.
Seattle. Right.
But yeah, Philly's a place where I feel comfortable everywhere I go. And I feel like I'm never in a room where people are looking at me like, how did he get here? It's
Right.
always just assumed like, oh, this person probably does something interesting
Right.
and adds something amazing. Um, yeah, so that's why I love Philly.
So what were you doing? So you didn't come to Page as the director of Page, right? You came in some other position, correct?
Yeah, so after I, did my nonprofit work and stuff, I ended up consulting and then running a business. When I was running my business, I did work with the city, I did work with institutions, and I learned how much of a pain it was to do that. And at the same time, I met Jeff Hornstein, who now runs the Economy League, and learned about some of the early concepts behind Page. So that was my introduction to it when I was a business owner. When my oldest son was born about 4 years ago, I realized that I wasn't gonna, I didn't want to be a business owner and a dad at the same time, especially with a young kid. I was like, I don't want to be that person that's never around. So I kind of set the business aside. I worked with some other people, did more consulting, and I ended up consulting with the Economy League. And from there, I came on as the business engagement manager for the Page program. And then when my former, well, she's still my boss, but the former Page director, Janelle, was promoted, I moved up into this role. And since then, I've made a couple changes to the way the program runs. We've really focused on getting tangible results on the capital side through our grant program and through partnerships, as well as we've done a really big pivot into real estate and construction as a core
Mm,
focus area,
mhm.
just due to the
What
amount of.
about life sciences, Kenyatta? Are you guys kind of going into that area?
So life sciences is a weird one for us, right? Because one, the startup costs are extremely high. So you
Right.
get less and less minority businesses as you move along that value chain. And the other thing is our institutional partners, they are making investments into the life sciences world, but kind of tangentially, right? So they're like investing in other things that then do life sciences,
Mm-hmm.
investing in the building or the training for a larger life science project. So it doesn't give us a lot of direct ways in. The ways that we're supporting with life sciences are helping the MBEs that do touch on the space get contracts with hospitals, with
Right.
colleges to
Right.
grow their, businesses and lab
Have you
supplies.
guys worked with IMSCO?
Yeah, so we were pretty central to IMSCO's growth early on, when it was really Jeff Hornstein and Harold Epps that were pushing the program forward. They kind of outlined this vision around IMSCO for what it looks like to invest in an MBE. And then the team there, Ken Carter, Lynn Thomas, others, they were able to execute on that vision in a way
Mm.
that I think made the entire city understand the impact of it. And now they just had their ribbon cutting for a new building. They've made tremendous investments in one
Yes.
building.
Yes.
And that's been centered around, institutional contracts that really
Yes.
got them there.
Yes. Um, it's interesting. I mean, I talk about life sciences because I see there's so much um real estate development and construction around the life sciences space. And so when that happens, you're gonna the construction piece is gonna leave. And then we have all of these other opportunities. And the question is, how do we take advantage of them? I mean, I know another area which you guys I don't believe you focus on, but I think is extremely important is workforce development, um,
Yeah.
pipeline development. Like we have a serious, even in the construction space, as I'm sure you've learned, we have a serious pipeline issue. We can say what we want in terms of how many people of color we want on this project, but if they're not there, they're not there, right?
Yeah. So it's not a place, since we only have three staff on our team. It's not a place where we do a lot of work directly, but
Right.
we have engaged partners because high level, we have a lot of the connections necessary to make things move. So for example, on the construction side, we've been working with the Everybody Builds team since before they had staff. And they're really the ones that are going to centralize and standardize, pre-apprenticeship programs and all these other things to help people get hands-on experience with construction, to help people get into unions and to see that as a career path. Because, I mean, I don't think it's any big secret, but, unions in Philadelphia have been racist and exclusionary for a long time. And it creates a system where people of color either distrust the unions or just don't see that as a viable career option.
Right.
So we have to unpack, decades of old policies and perspectives around what these jobs are like and how you'll be treated in order just to get people willing to do this work. And then
Hmm.
once people get on the jobs, we have to make sure that they are getting mentorship, support, help to build, really robust careers. My
Did you?
uncle was a union carpenter,
Uh,
and from there he moved to working with the city, which he enjoyed a lot more because despite the fact that he was one of the best carpenters when it came to like detailed work, they just had him putting up sheetrock all the time.
right.
Right? This is a big black guy. They're like, yeah, go
Right.
put up the sheetrock.
Right.
He then went back to school and became an engineer and is now an engineer for the city. And I think that, to waste talent like that
Right.
from it's just a mistake from their perspective as well.
Right. What was your major in college?
So I started off with business and then political science. Just made that shift.
That
Um,
is a common shift, by the way.
and I don't have any like advanced degrees, so I've also been considering, if I'm back in school, do I want to study something like urban planning? Do I want to study something like, economic development? Um, if I could get someone else to pay, right? If a university came to me and said, we would love to have you as a part of our institution and do some research and figure some stuff out, we'll pay you or make it free. I would want to understand economic development programs at the local level. Know what I mean? Like there's all of these economic
Well,
development.
they have things called PhD programs. That's exactly what happens.
So
What
I don't
happens
think
is the
I could
university
afford.
lets you in, they give you some grant money, and you study that particular issue that you're interested in. You've heard of
I don't
that?
know that I could afford my life on a PhD program salary.
Well,
Uh,
there's that.
One of
There's
my
that.
best friends just completed a PhD at Penn, at Wharton in business ethics. And I saw them struggle, and I was like, not with two kids.
I know. Yeah, no. Believe me, I had to make that decision a long time ago. I was I was in a dual degree program for law
Mm,
and public policy, but I really wanted to get a PhD. But I had my first son, who's now, old, um, at that same time, and just couldn't. And my wife was a PhD student herself, so just
yeah.
couldn't make that work. So I had to start working. So
Yeah, for sure. And I know that there's different ways, like if you can package on enough grants or do other things, there's different
yes,
ways to make it work. But
it's hard though.
yeah, exactly. And I don't know that that's the best direction for me to go. But
What's
I
your
do.
passion? Is this your passion?
So I like economic development, both locally, but also like I'm known a lot for like having headphones on at all of the events or like showing up with my big headphones all the
Mm,
time. And I like to listen to a lot of podcasts and ebooks. And mostly what I'm listening to was like the China and Africa podcast. I love learning about economic development as policy all over the world. Like I said, my father's side of the family is West African. I think that there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had around what actual economic development looks like.
mm.
We know at the like country level what people want to do with monetary policy, right? Like that's always in discussion. But like, how do you make a city vibrant? Why is it that some cities lose all their industries and some cities, even if one industry leaves, the city stays vibrant and something else comes in, right? Like why is it that as much as people on Wall Street complain about taxes, they never leave New York, but auto left Detroit? You see what I'm saying?
Right.
Like there's all of these questions I have around the way we think about the intersection of workforce development, access to capital, support for entrepreneurs, and the actual physical infrastructure in a place that makes some things really vibrant and interesting and engaging, and make it so that other things kind of wane with time or just don't have that same level of economic activity.
So, it's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about the difference. You gave the New York example. And it's interesting because I don't believe the only time New York real estate has lost value in a substantial way is when the country as a whole was in a deep recession or a depression, right?
Mhm.
Other than that, real estate values in New York continue to appreciate. And Philadelphia, in Philadelphia, that has not been the case, right? So you now see an appreciation of real estate values just now let's call it in the past 20 years, since 2008. But the reason why Philadelphia theoretically has been attractive to investors is because the land values are cheaper here than they are in the New York metropolitan area and the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, right? But we're between those. The point is, though, that the only reason why the values continue to grow to go up is because of the capital investments that are happening in the city, right? So you have more development, which means more investment in the city, right? You have better infrastructure as a result of the development. You have, other things that happen as a result of the development, more amenities in that particular area, whatever the case may be. And then you have other investment that comes after that as a
Mhm.
result of that initial investment. I mean, that's at least the strategy, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is for many, many years, people have not seen the value of real estate in Philadelphia, right?
Yeah,
And that has
so
changed.
I think I think that there's a couple of things there.
Okay.
Um, One is New York has done a really good job of building density around key infrastructure. And I think Chicago has also done a pretty good job of this as a city. New York has these two mega airports that can take you all over the world, and
Correct.
you're like in the city, right?
Three. Three.
Well, if you include Newark, but Newark is not Newark provides a really important low-cost outlet, but it's not densified around Newark the way like LaGuardia and
Right.
JFK, right?
Agreed. Agreed.
Same thing with Reagan and DC. Like
Right.
you're in and out of the city in like literally Bangkok, and then you
Yes.
land and you're 5 minutes away.
Right.
Um, if you go all by train, right, Penn Station in New York is in Midtown, like you're right there.
Right.
And then you have all of this connective tissue with their train system, as well as high density in the city throughout. So you can get people to the things that you need to do very
Mm-hmm.
easily.
Uh-huh.
The area around 30th Street for a long time in Philadelphia just was not densified, right? There's not really a lot of housing around there.
Correct.
There used to be like a lot of government buildings that
Correct.
didn't really do anything for the
Right.
general populace or business activity. Our airport's not far, But it's just not the same scale of airport as like Newark, JFK, LaGuardia, Reagan. So the international flights to just get anywhere and then come into Philly, generally
Oh,
you're actually flying into New
so
York.
you're comparing us to the financial capital of the country, if not the world, on one
Yeah,
hand, and the
the capital.
political capital of the country.
Yeah, if
So,
not the
I
world.
mean,
On the other hand, I don't think that we need to do the same things, but I think that there's lessons we can take away from what's happening, right?
okay,
So, for example, North Philadelphia Station is this derelict mixture of Amtrak and SEPTA station,
yes,
where you
yes,
can literally hop on a train that will take you
yes,
to Harrisburg or New York very easily,
yeah.
and we have zero density around it, right? Like this area is surrounded by like abandoned warehouses and blight.
So I will tell you, I don't think this is, I think this is any secret. There was a plan for development around there, right?
Mhm,
They had a developer in place to develop the land around there. And then the developer was based in New York and was really known in New York for doing condominium developments, a la Allen Dom.
mhm.
And um, there was a financial bump that happened. I don't remember when that happened now. Let's call it 2016, 2017.
Yep.
Um, and the company went away and the development went away. And they
Mhm.
haven't done anything since with that property. So there is I think that there is an acknowledgement that, and I think that RFP was issued by Amtrak. So there
Mhm.
was an acknowledgement
Of the value.
um, of the, the need
Yeah.
for something, that kind of development in that area.
Yeah, I think that people see it. But to push through and execute just doesn't happen at the same scale as it does in other regions.
Mm,
I think, a problem that we have is that our
that's
state,
because of capital.
it is, but
It's
it's
because of
also
capital.
because of the way that the government thinks about these spaces and the types of incentives that they set up, the type of structures that they create
Yeah,
and their pre-work, right? It's also because like the closest institution, Temple, might not see that as a benefit to them to start to make early investments there that would de-risk it for
correct.
capital.
And they would not. Right. I mean,
Um,
well, they've made significant investments, but
they have, but it's a bit away from main campus, so it's not going to have the same value to them. And I think that this is the place where coordination amongst institutions, the city, the state could all come in.
I agree with that.
Also, are a city that's been in a relatively hostile state towards city development for a while. So
Yeah.
that can make things difficult. And then I think the final thing I'll say on this is that New York does a much better job of trying to develop its workforce towards the industries that it has than we do in Philadelphia.
1000% agree with that.
And to a lesser extent, I would say Chicago, definitely California. I mean, this is one of the things that has made California such a standout state,
Right.
and more recently, Texas. I think people understand workforce development is important. We have a lot
But
of institutions.
when you think about California and Texas, um, the governor of California recently was interviewed. I saw a snippet of an interview with him and Hannity, and
Mhm.
he was laying in Hannity.
He was.
Um, but he was making the point of just how vibrant that economy is in California.
Mhm.
And if you have a vibrant economy or a vibrant business, whatever the case may be, it means you need workers. You need workers, right? And
Mhm.
the state is getting the resources it needs to then invest in impact on pipeline development. What we have in Pennsylvania, to your point, is number one, you have a government that most times is antagonistic to the city of Philadelphia,
Mhm.
and then if they're not antagonistic, they're indifferent. So we don't have, again, a state government. Well, perhaps we do now with the new leadership, but we haven't had a state government that's really thought through how to properly invest in workforce development, knowing and understanding that the city of Philadelphia's education system is just not getting it done, right?
Sure.
It's just
And
not
we
getting it done.
are, you know, I think Bruce Katz has done some amazing work around like the need for this sort of planning. He's
Mhm.
based out of Drexel, amazing academic, but like the need for this sort of regional planning when it comes to workforce development, business development across multiple sectors. But I think that, you know, we are an exporter of education, right? People come here, they get educated, they pay, and then they leave.
Yes,
They go someplace else.
yes.
Whereas I think New York sees themselves more as a workforce developer, right? Like they're not necessarily, not to say that they're not an exporter of education too, because they have a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
universities,
yeah, yeah,
some
yeah, yeah,
portion
yeah,
of
yeah,
it.
yeah. Right, right,
But
right.
there's also a certain portion of education that they see as taking people in New York and preparing them for the
Well, I
workforce.
mean, again, the difference is this, right? So people, so you made the point that, New York has a ton of educational institutions, more than we do, actually.
Mhm.
Um, but those people, when they get their education, by and large, they're staying in New York, right? Why are they staying in New York? Because there are jobs in New York, because there's industry in New York. You know, we are, I think, kind of headed to a different phase of our history here in Philadelphia if this life sciences piece really takes hold. Um, that will be the basis for, I think, other things to come into our area. But a lot of those jobs, um, now you have jobs that college kids can say, okay, I will stay in Philadelphia, right? Because there's opportunity for me here for what I
Mhm.
do and what I'm interested in. But then you will have, again, the added benefit of just creating other industry around it. And that's how you're going to begin to grow this economy so that we're not, because Philadelphia right now, I bet you dollars to donuts that most of the wage taxes that Philadelphia collects are from public sector workers.
Public nonprofit. Yeah, I
Right.
mean,
Public nonprofit workers.
yeah, I would definitely believe that given the scale of the universities and hospitals in the region. I think like once again, this requires economic coordination
Mm-hmm.
because Philadelphia is a growing life science hub, but we
Mm-hmm.
are largely a life science hub on the research end.
Right.
Like,
Well, we're moving into manufacturing though, just so
we
we're clear.
are,
We are moving into manufacturing.
but we do not have like Penn State should be a much larger player in educating that manufacturing workforce.
Great.
I think that CCP is doing some really interesting things and creating opportunities for people to move into this without spending a lot of money, like creating almost apprenticeship style programs.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people get paid a lower wage, they get
Mm-hmm.
training, and then they move into higher wage opportunities. That's important. But we really need a way for the city and state institutions to come together and say, this is how we invest in a life science workforce if we're going to do manufacturing at scale. And it's the same thing that we need on the construction side, right? Like we need the unions, we need the local institutions, and we need the city and state-run institutions to come together and say, we're going to create a world-class construction workforce.
Mm-hmm.
This is what it looks like. This is how
Mm-hmm.
many engineers we need. This is how many
Mm-hmm.
architects. This is how
Yep.
many construction
Yep.
managers. And then to put that together so that it matches demand. And that just requires coordination. Like I don't think it's impossible. I don't even think it's necessarily that difficult to do. But what I find is that a lot of states like ours, which are kind of like Rust Belt states, we get very nostalgic about the way things used to be with steel or with coal or with whatever. And we try to hold on to a lot of old ideas around industrial planning.
Yeah.
when
But you
really
know,
we should be looking forward.
Pittsburgh has been very good about that. Pittsburgh, if one city was going to die, right? Pittsburgh was a huge candidate for that, right? And
Mhm.
really reinvented itself around software engineering, right? And that just kind of again it blew up into all of this other stuff, right? Because you had Amazon, I think, came in, you had Google come in. So you have these big companies coming into Pittsburgh,
Yeah, to
right?
support that workforce.
Right.
And
So
you had
okay,
Carnegie Mellon
but here's the
overproducing
thing.
people of that
Again,
skill
just
set.
like here's the thing, just like Penn, right? Carnegie Mellon kids would go to Carnegie Mellon and then they'd leave Pittsburgh. They weren't
Yeah,
staying in Pittsburgh. So now you have those kids staying in Pittsburgh, right? Because they are good jobs in Pittsburgh. So now they're raising their families in Pittsburgh. So now they care about the schools in Pittsburgh. Like all of this feeds one another. But in my opinion, you have to first, to your point, you certainly have to have good planning, but ultimately you're having good planning to attract private capital, right? And if we can't attract private capital at the end of the day, you can't sustain it indefinitely without private capital.
I agree with that, but I think that one of the problems that we have is that we often try to attract private capital at the capital level instead of at like the economic production level,
Mm.
right? Like capital, as much as people will talk about, oh, well, we need to do taxes or we need to do incentives or we need to do whatever. California is an expensive state to do business.
It is.
And it has the capital there because they have the talent, because they have the skill sets, because they have the ecosystem. And I think that we have to develop the seeds, the core of an ecosystem.
Oh, this is a chicken or
Capital
egg.
can build on
This
top
is a
of.
chicken or egg question, I think, though, right? This is a chicken or egg question. I mean, which came first, the resources or like how did that work exactly? I mean, I think that at the end of the day, so let me be clear. Government plays a huge role in how we allocate resources to develop programs, to develop industry, to develop workforce. It has a huge role to play into being a catalyst for economic development and growth,
Mhm.
right? So I'm completely 1,000% agree with that. But you still have to, the training programs have to be training people for an industry that exists,
Absolutely.
right? So you still have to have the buy-in from private capital to be able to fully realize a vision for economic development in a particular area, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, I guess that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think that we become short-sighted when we talk about private capital because we think that the thing that's most necessary is like low cost and not high economic output. And that's the only point I'm trying to make.
I got you.
Capital wants economic output, right? Like it makes sense to do business in a New
They
York or
want ROI.
California.
They want
Exactly.
ROI. Yes.
And ROI does not always mean buying the cheapest thing.
Right.
No, I mean, otherwise people would
I
be
completely agree
flocking to
with that.
like Ohio.
Completely agree with that. No, I get you. I
And,
get
and
you.
I, but I think that sometimes in the political framing of this, it's like, oh, well, we have to have the best incentive package to
Well,
get
I
this
mean, it
here.
goes back to the reason why we can't, one of the reasons why we can't be competitive with other cities, or we struggle to be competitive. Like when you compare Philadelphia, if Philadelphia is in a running and Boston's in a running for some big company to, land its spaceship in its area,
Mhm.
one of the things they're going to look at is how's your public school system,
For
right?
sure.
Because we're trying to bring like 1,000 people here, and they need to be. It would help
They want to
us.
live. But yeah,
It would help us because now we don't have to pay them more so that they can afford private tuition or whatever the case may be, right?
the huge advantage Seattle has, right? One of the
Right,
best in,
right,
inner
right,
city public schools in the
right.
region. and you
right,
see all
right.
the businesses there. Yeah.
So, yeah, so that is absolutely an area where we need to be competitive. We are
Mhm.
not competitive, right?
And I
So,
think, like, getting back to the core of the conversation, one of the ways we make that competitive is by making intentional investments in Black communities. Because let's be real about where the schools are worse, right? Where they're closing, where there's the most asbestos. It's in the communities of people that look like me, right? Like I went to Lee as a kid. And now, yeah, Penn is looking at maybe helping to update that school, but that was not the case when I was there. You see what I'm saying? I
right,
think that there's a way that race plays into this, and having a Black business class that has successful businesses and is willing to advocate on behalf of neighborhoods in North Philadelphia, West Philadelphia, South Philadelphia, where we are one of the predominant groups. People that have the skills and experience to fill those school board spots or charter school boards that are dedicated to the area and know the community.
right.
It also means just a clearer investment in the way these things look and move forward, even just the quality of the buildings themselves. Um, it also means, a more holistic approach, right? How do people go from school to rec center? How do people get from A to B? Are we keeping SEPTA safe and clean and
Right.
comfortable for
Yes.
children?
Yes. Yes.
Um, and I think that programs like Page and others that support the growth of the minority community are going to naturally feed back into improvements in some of these areas as well.
Kenyatta James, thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of our show today. We really appreciate your insight. I would love to do this again. It seems like we just started the conversation. There's a lot more to talk about and to hash out, but we appreciate your time today.
Yeah, it's always amazing to speak with you. I'm glad that I was able to share some interesting perspective, and we should definitely reconnect once the legal fallout of the Supreme Court decision is clear
Yes,
to see how it's affecting our work.
absolutely. And to our audience, thank you for being a part of our show today. We look forward to continuing the discussion and keeping it going. Until the next time, be well.